Alright kids, Mr. Otway here with his low-tech explanation of how to tackle this interpretation question. An historian says a lot of things, and you're being asked how far do you agree with him. The key thing of all the things he says Britain was transformed entirely. Anybody travelling forward in time would barely recognise the country. All of these things, ways of living, transport, work, food, education, health, selections of aspects of life that changed utterly. Now, yes, the country changed. It's this phrase, utterly and transformed entirely, that you've got to decide whether you agree or disagree. And if you look at this as the evidence that you all collected the other week, you can see that something stayed the same. So it's quite difficult to say that it changed entirely and utterly when a number of things stayed the same. Yes, some things changed, but it's hard to argue utterly. Anyway, what you've got to do, if you're thinking about, well, how do I do this? Look at what you did for the JFK assessment, which was also an interpretation, and do the same. But do better, because you'll have focused on your targets and your resulting green pen. So if you do whatever I've asked you to do to improve, and what you did before, you'll automatically get better. And I really want you to show me where you're improving your work by writing that bit in a different colour or highlighting it. So if I've said you need to make sure you include more quotes from the interpretation, put the quotes in red, in pink, in purple, in green, I don't care. Just make it stand out. So back to this. You have a look at this, you think, do I agree, do I disagree? You might completely agree, completely disagree, or somewhere in the middle. Well, I've written an introduction for you here. And in an introduction in history, you start just one sentence, that's all you need. You state what your argument is. So in this, and I'm not saying this is the right answer, in fact, I'll give you a hint, it might be a little bit wrong. But here's an example of what you could do. An historian's interpretation, let me start, an historian, I'll put my finger over the S, is correct in his assertions that the Industrial Revolution changed Britain utterly in all of the areas that he gives. So that's just your stated argument. Now you might say I disagree with him, you might say, well, he's mostly right, something like that, but that's all you do. One sentence, here's my argument. And then you've got to choose your paragraphs. I'm going to put my hand over that, because the standard thing to do would be to do a paragraph on all the reasons you might agree with an historian. So you look at this and think, right, what has completely changed of these things? What's totally new? And down here, you've got your next paragraph, reasons why you might disagree. So if we look at transport, for example, so I've put it in red and prepared, you see, you can say, well, in terms of transport, things changed a heck of a lot. Trains came along, you could travel further and faster than you could ever before. Before you had to rely on yourself or an animal like a horse. Well, trains don't get tired, they can go so much faster than horses for so much longer, and trams are the same. It had an impact on the economy because you could transport your goods easier around the place. On leisure time, it even involved the football leagues developing. Huge transformation, but not utterly transformed, not transformed entirely, because trains only go where the tracks are, and so do trams. There's no cars by 1900. They've been invented, but they're not out in the wider public yet. So you still need to use horse and cart. Just to give you an example, like the farmer needs to get his things to market. What are the chances there's a train station outside the farm? Very unlikely. So he's going to have to get on his horse and cart and take his things to the market. We can see here pubs feature heavily in both periods. Well, the brewery making the beer, what are the chances that well, there's not going to be railways next to every single pub, so they'd have to use a horse and cart. So in your paragraph disagree, you might pick out transport and say, well, if you're looking at transport, an historian might not be right. That's one way you could do your paragraphs. And I will talk about the next other option soon. A conclusion, when you get to a conclusion, that's what you got to do. State your argument again, but this time you pick key bits of evidence to support what you say. And I've got a bit of a formula that I came up with last year with some students of how you can write a really good conclusion. And the way you could do it is by starting your conclusion with in conclusion, using in particular, so that you can then put in a really good bit of evidence to support your argument, and then just revert back to your argument, state it again by using thus. And here's an example. And again, this isn't the right answer. In fact, I would say this is a little bit wrong in what it says, but here's a great example of what a conclusion could look like. In conclusion, an historian's interpretation is entirely correct. See, we've already seen it's not, so you can't copy this conclusion, but this person says, in particular, it's obvious that healthcare changed utterly, with anaesthetics, the discovery of germs, new ways to stop blood loss in surgery, just some of the developments. Thus, A&H is correct, and the Industrial Revolution changed Britain utterly. There we go. In conclusion, in particular, thus, equals smashing conclusion. So that's the basics of what you've got to do. Read that. Think, do you agree with what he says? Look at your evidence. You've got loads in your folders as well. Don't just rely on that. You've got more than what's up here. Do an introduction. Do some paragraphs. Do a conclusion. And if you're thinking, what am I supposed to do? Do whatever you did for your JFK assassination thing, but do it better, because you'll have focused on your targets. There is, of course, an option to do your paragraphs a bit differently. And this is a bit more advanced. Instead of doing just for and against, you can take it a section at a time, because A&H mentions transport, health, education, work, food, all these different things that you mentioned. You could take it a bit at a time. That's a lot harder. I'd recommend doing it like this, but this is something you can think about moving to. You could have a go at it. It's more advanced. It's harder to do than just agree and disagree. But by all means, have a go. And don't forget, when you're going through this, you can always pause and rewind and go back to my explanation when you get. So if you start doing your instruction thinking, how do I do it? Well, you've got an example one there. You get to your paragraphs, you think, well, what am I supposed to do here? Well, I haven't given you an example here. I've given you some sentence starters you could include, but look back at the JFK assessment. What did you do there? And then your conclusion, you have got an example. And I've written in it conclusion example because lots of you have that as a target. And there we go. That's your advice on how to do this interpretation.